Eagle Song, Chapter 7, A Falling Eagle. It wasn't a good dream. Danny sat up in bed, shaking his head to clear it away. The green numbers of the clock said it was only 6:05 in the morning. The dream had left tears in his eyes. Danny felt like getting up and climbing into bed with his mother, even though he was much too old to do that. He kept seeing the dream. In it, a beautiful eagle sat on top of a pine tree, watching over the peaceful land below it. Suddenly, something came spinning out of the sky toward the eagle. Danny could see that it was going to hit the eagle and knock it out of the tree. He tried to shout, warning, but no words could come from his mouth. He got up and looked out the window. There was dirty snow on the streets. The wind and snow had swept in the night before. It was too early in the year for snow like this, but it had come anyway. A few cars were moving slowly on the snowy street. It looked cold out there. It was even colder than it looked. As Danny and his mother walked to church, the wind whipped at their coats. In the stories his father told him, the winter wind was an old man with long, skinny fingers. Danny shivered at the feel of those cold fingers touching his skin. By the time church ended, the sun had come out and the wind was gone. His father would be at work now. Danny looked up at the tops of the tallest buildings. He imagined men working up there, guiding the steel girders into place and connecting them together. They would use long-handled spud wrenches, like his father's, to turn the big steel bolts. By late afternoon, the wind had come back again. The sun was hidden behind a dark cloud and more snow was falling. Danny watched out the window, wondering what the weather was like near Philadelphia. On the map in his classroom, it was farther south than New York City. Maybe it was warmer there. It probably wasn't snowing. Danny thought again about his dream and then pushed it out of his mind. The phone rang and Danny jumped. He ran into the other room, but his mother had already taken it off the wall. "Yes, this is Sally Bigtree." Danny stopped in front of his mother. Someone was talking on the other end. The voice sounded like the buzzing of a fly. His mother's forehead was creased with worry lines as she listened and her eyes were shut. "What happened?" his mother said. The fly buzzed again at the other end of the line. "I don't care about that. Is he all right?" His mother turned her back to Danny and leaned her head against the wall. Again the fly buzzed as Danny tried to understand what was being said. He knew what the call was about. He felt like a fist had been shoved into his stomach. His mother hung up the phone. She turned back to him. "There's been an accident," she said. "Your father was hurt and we're going to him, now." She paused. "I'll pack some clothes and your toothbrush for you. You get your coat." Danny held his mother's hand as they sat in the subway car. He kept on holding it as they climbed onto the bus at the Port Authority terminal. The rumble of the wheels under their seats was comforting to Danny. It reminded him of the trip they'd made a month ago up north to go back home to the res and visit his grandparents on Cornwall Island in the middle of St. Lawrence River. As they sat in the bus, neither of them said much. Every iron worker's family knew that accidents could happen, but Danny had never believed his father could get hurt. He still couldn't believe it. "He'll be okay, right, Mom?" "That's right, Danny," his mother said, but he could hear the worry in her voice. His mother had thrown some food for them in a paper bag, an orange, 2 apples, some packages of crackers with cheese on them, a box of Oreo cookies. Every half hour they would eat something. By the time the bag was empty, it was late. Danny leaned his head against his mother's shoulders. He didn't want to fall asleep. He was afraid he would dream again, but he was very tired, and so he closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there were lights all around the bus, and it was slowing down. "Philadelphia," his mother said to him. The wind was blowing in Philadelphia, too, but there was no snow on the ground. They caught a taxi outside the bus terminal. Danny was still tired, and his eyes kept closing as he sat in the taxi. It didn't seem to take them long to reach the hospital. There was a man in coveralls sitting in a chair outside the door of the hospital room they were told to go to. He didn't look Indian, though. Danny knew you couldn't ever be sure. Some Mohawks had blue eyes and blonde hair. He stood up. "Hi, Mrs. Bigtree," he said. "Hal Weiser. We met before. I'm Rick's pusher." Danny's mother nodded, and Danny nodded too. He knew that the pusher was the foreman, the man with the blueprints. He and his mother were ready to go into the room and see Danny's father, but this man wanted to talk. He needs to talk, Danny thought. "He's okay, you know," Hal said. "What he did was, he saved a man's life. It was because of the crane operator. Nobody knew he'd been drinking. I signaled him to raise the load." Hal Weiser pointed his finger toward the ceiling and made a circle with it. Danny knew that signal. His father had taught him all the different hand signals that were used on the job. But instead, what he did was lower the girder. It hit the column and it spun. It would have knocked Albert Hill right off if your husband hadn't jumped off just like a cat onto the girder Albert was on to pull him back. The spinning girder just grazed Rick, but it was enough to break his leg and knock him off the tower. Hal Weiser was talking louder and moving his hands as he talked. "Never saw nothing like it before. I was watching from 12 stories down." He looked at Danny as if seeing him for the first time. "Your father?" Danny nodded. "Your father. I thought he was a goner. But he spread his arms out like they was wings, and he grabbed the beam 10 foot below him as he was falling. That's when he broke his ribs. But he still hung on there until the men on the bolting crew could grab his belt and pull him up." Hal Weiser paused. "He's mad at me 'cause I called you. Did I do the wrong thing?" Danny's mother took Hal Weiser by the hand and then kissed him on the cheek. "You did the right thing," she said. Hal Weiser's face got as red as a spotlight. "He was awake the last time I looked in. Now you're here. I guess I'll go back to the motel." Richard Bigtree's face was pale. The white sheets and the hospital gown made it look paler still. He opened his eyes as they came in and he smiled. He looked better when he smiled. "I didn't want them to tell you right away," he said. "I didn't want you to worry. It's just a busted leg and 3 cracked ribs." "We're not worried," Danny's mother said. "We're here." She leaned over and kissed Danny's father and hugged him. "Now I got 4 cracked ribs," Danny's father said. All 3 of them laughed. While Danny's mother went to get coffee for them from the machine down the hall, Danny sat with his father. "Dad," he said, "I had a dream last night. I saw something falling from the sky and knock an eagle out of a tree. It was scary." Danny's father was silent for what seemed to be a long time. Then he nodded and reached his hand out to place it on Danny's chest. "Danny," he said, "dreams are important things. You should always listen to them. But don't let them scare you, okay?" "Okay, Dad." "Looks like I'll be home for a while. Maybe I'll put that degree I got from Potsdam College to work and do some substitute teaching. Doesn't pay like ironwork does, but you don't get your ribs broke when you fall off a desk." Danny laughed, but it was a short laugh. His father's joke had made him remember school. Danny's father looked closely at him. "What happened to your nose and your lip?" "Basketball." "I didn't know you played." "I don't. Tyrone hit me in the face with his basketball." Danny hadn't meant to cry, but there were tears in his eyes now. Danny's father nodded. "Things didn't get better right away after I visited the school, eh?" "No." "It's hard to believe in peace, Danny. There's a lot of danger in the world. Things happen when you don't expect them." There's so many people who will tell you that it doesn't make any sense to believe in peace, but it takes a lot more courage to make a friend sometimes than it does to make an enemy. Having friends is a risky thing, you might say. Albert Hill is your friend, isn't he? Danny's father chuckled. You could say that. He's gotten me in trouble more than once, though. I ever tell you how he tipped over his grandmother's outhouse when we were kids? When his grandmother asked at dinner about who did it, we confessed. His grandmother had told us about how when George Washington was a little boy, he cut down his father's cherry tree, and when George confessed, he didn't get punished because he told the truth. You know that story, don't you? Danny nodded. Danny's father chuckled again and pressed his hand to his side. Got to remember not to laugh with these cracked ribs. So when Albert and I confessed, we figured we would be home free. But Albert's grandmother grabbed him and started swatting him on the butt with her cane. Albert hollered out, "When George Washington confessed that he cut down his father's cherry tree, his father didn't whomp him." And Albert's grandma, she hollered, "George Washington's father was not in that cherry tree when he cut it down." Danny shook his head and then began to laugh. Cracked ribs and all, his father laughed with him. Everything was going to be okay after all.